Chapter 14, Dreaming Spires. Renewing contact with Eileen, my birth mother, was a huge step for me. We have stayed in contact and remained friends ever since, although I will always think of my grandparents as my real mum and dad. It also helped solve my immediate problem as I prepared to enter university. Eileen drove me around from flat to flat until I found a place I could just about afford, relatively near to my university campus in Watford, hardly Cambridge, the City of Dreaming Spires, but at least it could earn me my much desired degree. My birth mother did help me with some rent payments and money for books, but it was still a constant struggle in those first few months finding enough money just to eat and house myself, let alone go out and have some fun. I was holding down several part-time jobs at once, cycling everywhere I could, because I didn't have the money for buses, and trying to study as well. I was just so tired all the time that it was hard to concentrate on what I was supposed to be studying. At times, I came close to giving up, but that would have meant an even worse fate, working full-time in the sort of dead-end job that I was already doing to survive. Every time I even considered jacking the whole thing in, my granddad's word would ring in my ears. "You've got to get an education, Miranda. Never give up on your education." It was his inspiration that kept me going when life seemed impossible. There was never enough time to do all of the normal things to keep life running smoothly. People think that university students have lazy lives, but I was on a media course, which meant that even if lectures didn't run till 5 each evening, I still had to watch films or use the edit suites whenever they were available. There were lots of books or audio and videotapes to buy, so much money to pay out when I didn't have any financial help from my family at that stage, or indeed, at any other stage. When I first moved in, I had a cleaning job after studies, so would cycle to college in the morning, cycle back to my room, and then between PM and PM every weeknight, I did my cleaning job. On Saturdays, I worked in a local River Island clothes store, which left Sunday as my only day off. About every third weekend, I would completely run out of clean clothes. Naturally, I didn't have a washing machine, and I certainly couldn't afford washing powder and launderettes. The solution was to pile all of my washing into a bag after work on Saturday evening and head for the train station. I hated that half-mile walk and the necessary trudge down the bloody station steps with a passion. The cheapest train ticket would take me to my birth mother's house in Buckinghamshire, where I would load up her washing machine and then often stay the night so that she could drive me back home on the Sunday. She had helped me get a phone so that we could talk once in a while. Our relationship was still strained. There was a lot of distance there and it was awkward, but at least we were trying. I was finding it hard to get over my disappointment at how she had treated me the last time we'd met. I was still angry, fucking angry actually, and still felt betrayed and annoyed that she had taken her husband's side in a silly row, without thinking of how she was rejecting me. I really do not know if my hurt feelings had anything to do with the earlier rejections in my life, her giving me up in the first place, and then not asking for me back when she had another family whose lives I might have shared. People close to me have suggested that I must have harbored resentment about it, but the truth is I had never known her as a mother, and so growing up with my grandparents was, for me, a perfectly natural thing to have happened. I did have a mum, my grandmother, and so I've never needed another one. On top of that, it is not as though my birth mother ever vanished completely from my life. As a child, I was always getting presents from her. She would telephone often and also turn up at the house with clothes or food to help my grandparents out. She was constantly there as a shadowy big sister presence in my life, just not as a mummy figure. My unorthodox lifestyle set me apart from every other uni student. At 19, I was just a little bit older than average, but the difference was far greater than that. You hear about all these students having fun, drinking. Well, that may be the case if you are middle class with wealthy parents. The people like me are the ones who never get to go to the parties because they either get part-time jobs or drop out into dead-end careers with no qualifications. Parties and drinking certainly weren't part of my life, because I was working every bloody hour God sent just to try and muddle my way through. All around me were students enjoying their first taste of freedom away from home. They were all, wow, I can do anything now, blah, blah, blah. Whilst I was like, yeah, I've been living away from anyone since I was 16. I just want to get this course over and done with. Everybody seemed interested in going drinking, but I just couldn't be arsed because I'd done all my clubbing and drug taking and partying and drinking years before. As the months went by, I could feel the university workload increasing, and time became even more precious. Even bank holidays such as Easter or Christmas were no holidays for me. They were a precious opportunity to get extra work done and earn extra money. I'm trying hard not to sound self-pitying, but it truly was a nightmare, a bloody nightmare to survive. Sometimes, I had to cycle to the supermarket and buy all these 9p tins of beans and then live on beans and bread and noodles. I had a friend in Southall who told me you could buy these really cheap packets of noodles there, so I would cycle over and pile them up high. I never really got fruit or vegetables, just the simplest things to have some kind of sustenance. By then I was an expert on living cheaply, so I would go shopping with only 3 or 4 pounds and come back with surprising amounts of bargain food. By my second year knew there was no way on earth that I could do this any longer. Something had to give. It was then that a friend, half jokingly, pointed out an advert in the local paper for escort services in West London. It was a typical massage parlor advertisement of the time, but buried in the body of the ad, extolling the dubious charms of the friendly and sexy girls, was an intriguing footnote. It offered good pay for a receptionist. My friend claimed she wanted to apply, but didn't have the nerve to call. I was desperate enough not to care about possible embarrassment. I picked up the phone. A week later, I started my first weekend shift as the receptionist in one of West London's busiest working girls' flats. I was certainly not a virgin. I had a keen and continuing interest in fetish fashion, and had played what I thought were some pretty kinky games with my boyfriend in the past. But answering the telephone in that flat was an eye-opener for me. Until that moment, I had no idea just how many men were willing to pay for sex. The phone rang constantly, literally never stopping. Just 18 years old, and relatively naive, I found myself talking to a succession of men about their crudest sexual fantasies. Some of the callers were embarrassed to the point of stammering stupidity. Many were clearly a little drunk, and some were brazen and just wanted to engage me in sex talk on the phone. My job was to try and make the girls sound as beautiful, as sexually voracious, and as alluring as possible without getting the guys so excited that they could take care of their frustration themselves over the phone for free. It was a fine line to tread, and it also required me to lie through my teeth. According to my patter, all of the women working there were slim and attractive. All were young and eager for sex. In this telephone fantasy land, the girls enjoyed all positions and were particularly fond of the more mature man. To be fair, many of the women were nice girls just trying to earn a living, but this was, in truth, merely a somewhat downmarket suburban brothel at a high-class international escort agency. I just had to make it sound like the latter rather than the former. Thus, a tubby, 58-year-old prostitute named Eileen, with graying, badly dyed blonde hair and troublesome lower back pain, transformed into Tamsin, young, in her early 30s, slim sexual athlete with a penchant for swinging from bedroom chandeliers. I also rapidly became adept at the codeword conversations that indicated the precise services on offer. Many, such as hand relief or oral, were self-explanatory, but others seemed to involve a somewhat stereotyped, racist geographical tour of Europe that took me some while to decipher. Does she do Greek? I would be asked, or French, without. Nowadays, even well-brought-up young ladies would have little trouble in translating those as requests for anal intercourse and fellatio without a condom, but I sometimes got a little lost on this continental journey. With a naturally mischievous streak, I was often tempted to make up my own nonsense terms for a giggle. She will do Finnish, and maybe Latvian, but don't you dare ask her for a Romanian kiss. Once I got over my initial awkwardness, and better learned the language of brothel speak, the job suited me down to the ground. Within days I was happily discussing a client's need for water sports which many of the girls didn't mind, or KVR, always, for some reason, with that spelling which none of the girls wanted to touch with a barge pole. I soon became adept at picking out the real weirdos who just might be dangerous, and the time wasters who just wasted my time talking. The girls were on the whole decent and kind to very young me, and it was interesting to hear snippets of the convoluted stories of their lives in between appointments. Most important of all, I suddenly found that I no longer had to worry where my next meal was coming from. For the first time in my life, I had good money in my pocket from my receptionist or maid duties. The real oddity was that my own sex life was just about non-existent at the time. I was living like a nun at home, but discussing every sexual perversion under the sun each weekend in one of London's busiest brothels. Throughout my young life, I had always striven to gain as much experience and knowledge as I could from every situation in which I had found myself. I started my mating with the attitude that this was going to be no more than a short-term financial fix to help me survive through to my graduation. Soon, however, I realized the scale of a hidden demand that was not being met. There was real financial potential right here. The mismatch in supply and demand that I had identified was for girls who could dominate men in the way they clearly desired. Answering the phones every day, I would get constant requests for domination services, but most of the girls would never entertain that sort of client. The brothel worked on encouraging a rapid turnover of straight sex appointments. The best clients were, to put it bluntly, in the door for a quick suck and a fuck, and back out again on the street, minus £60 from their wallets. The girls would charge extra for more fancy games, such as putting on some of the cheap and frankly tatty uniforms hanging up in each room, or for inserting their favorite dildo or vibrator into their pussy, waggling it around for a few minutes and then gasping their way to a patently fake conclusion. For the few extra pounds it was hardly worth their while to bother. They certainly didn't want to get involved in lengthy scenarios with submissive men who wanted to be humiliated or beaten, not least because none of them had the faintest idea of how to do that. For me, however, the prospect was intriguing. I had been fascinated by fetish clothing ever since first encountering Madonna in my early teens. Thigh-high boots, tight-fitting and shiny outfits in rubber or leather had always caught my eye. I knew I would never have the money to buy such clothes for myself. Why not indulge that particular passion for my own fun and make money as well? It just seemed a natural progression to willingly stroll down the road to where my own sexual enjoyment could be found. The opportunity to do that came a short while later when a new customer appeared on the doorstep and was ushered into one of the girls' bedroom. There was a brief interlude with the door shut, and then the girl reappeared and told me she didn't want to see this particular client. As far as I could establish, he had asked her for domination services that she didn't feel experienced enough to provide. Seizing the opportunity, I asked if she'd mind if I gave him a go. Moments later, it was me walking back into the bedroom while the working girl took a well-earned break. It was a watershed moment for me. I had started the day as a receptionist and maid, but was going to end it as a professional dominatrix. All I had to do was fulfill my first ever client's request. Tell me my cock is too small. Chapter 15. A Mistress's First Steps. The middle-aged man patiently awaiting my attention in the whorehouse bedroom was an unlikely candidate to be into kinky sex. He just appeared to be so normal, smartly dressed in a neat gray suit and looking every inch a dull civil servant. He immediately put me in mind of Penfold, the bespectacled little hamster companion of the cartoon character Danger Mouse, a firm television favorite of my youth. True to character, Penfold was clutching a briefcase from which he proceeded to pull out a stunning collection of items which would never have made it onto kids' TV. He carefully laid out a range of different sized plastic and rubber dildos in rows upon the bed. It was, to say the least, surprising, but I was determined not to giggle or react in any way which might shatter my first customer's illusions. The fake cocks ranged in size from a realistic half a dozen inches up to a monstrous pink penis, so long and fat that he must have bent it double to get into his case. Outwardly I just tried to look stern and commanding. Inside I was thinking, oh my God, what on earth is this lot? What on earth does he want me to do? What he did want was for me to criticize the size of his penis and compare it in the most unfavorable terms possible with the dildo cock collection he had prepared on the bed. I want you to tell me my cock is too small, he haltingly explained, his voice mumbling into his boots and sounding as nervous as a kitten. I was, luckily, that day wearing high boots with high heels, and so I was already towering over him as he nervously stammered out an explanation of his needs. I want you to compare me with these dildos and tell me that they are what women need, rather than someone small like me. I need you to humiliate me as much as you can. His demands were desperately light on detail because he could barely speak, either from excitement or fear. Little did he know, but he was probably talking to the only woman in London more nervous than him. My nervousness stemmed from the fact that I had never even considered such a scenario before. I'd always thought that you should big up, rather than belittle, the size of a man's penis. Outwardly I was oozing confidence, but I wasn't feeling confident at all. Could I do this without laughing or losing the plot? Well, I thought, let's give it a whirl. I cannot tell you how much fun I had. I started slowly by making him strip naked in the middle of the tiny bedroom with its sole bedside cabinet, a mirror on the wall and a rack of sexy uniforms all chained together. He obeyed instructions and just stood quietly whilst I walked around and around on the tatty gray carpet staring at his genitals. Truth is, I can't remember now, all these years later, whether or not he really was any smaller than average. After the first few thousand penises, they all seemed to merge into one, but I had no trouble in selecting suitable insults. You weren't exactly first in the queue when it came to handing out willies, were you? I sneered. How could you possibly think that any woman would be interested in that? You can't even make it hard, can you? It's useless. Absolutely fucking totally useless. As the session continued, I was going into more and more graphic detail of how inadequate a man Penfold was. At one point I tried measuring his flaccid cock in inches and estimating how tiny it really was. Then I picked up each dildo in turn from the bed and made him hold them against himself, laughingly pointing out that I was most definitely not comparing like with like here. Spotting that he was wearing a wedding ring, I got more and more personal. Does your wife even know if you push it inside her? I asked. She must still be a virgin. You'd never have broken her hymen with that thing. I bet she's probably out right now fucking the milkman, or any man with a decent size prick. I was absolutely loving every minute of the game, and amazing to see he was clearly growing more and more excited the nastier my creative imagination became. I was being an actress because this was all completely alien to me. I'd never encountered this type of play before. My only personal interest was in fetish wear and bondage play with my boyfriend, and the idea of humiliation was a bit of a revelation because I found it quite exciting and something I could really be good at. Over the years since I've learned that it is the feedback loop which creates my excitement as my client's excitement mounts. I get excited by the fact that I've excited him, if you see what I mean. I may not find what I am doing exciting per se, but the effect it has can be a major turn on. I hadn't thought so far ahead as to consider whether or not he might want to climax, but in the event he showed no interest in any form of relief, I could have stayed there all day, hurling out insults, but in the end, I thought I had best bring things to a close, I can't look at such a pathetic specimen anymore. It's insulting that you could even dare show me something that small. Put it away now and get out of my sight." Then I sat on the bed with my back towards him whilst he stumbled around trying to get dressed. With his clothes back on, he regained a little of the dignity I had so effectively stripped away over the previous half hour. The transformation was astounding. Penfold, the submissive little cartoon creature, vanished, and a confident businessman emerged. Now, it was my turn to be on the back foot as he asked me how much he owed for his session. I didn't have a clue what to charge him. I've not actually touched him, just give him all this verbal abuse, I thought. I can't charge him much, so I just said £30, the first figure that popped into my head. Considering the amount of time I had spent in the bedroom and the brothel's normal range of fees, I had cocked up, pun not intended, completely. Double that price might have been more appropriate. Unsurprisingly, Penfold was delighted to settle his bill. "Thank you, mistress," he said. "A wonderful session. Thank you so much. You're the best mistress I've ever seen. I may have undercharged, I may have been inexperienced, but I'd had a bucket load of fun." And Penfold went away as happy as Larry. I was happy too. I had just earned what for me was a lot of money with the greatest of ease, and without even having to touch my first client. The other girls were impressed when I told them the story, not with the unusual kinkiness of his request, but at the way that I had been able to dream up so many insults and keep the abuse flowing. "How can you do that?" asked one of the women. "I could tell a man his dick was small, but not in enough ways to keep him paying for an hour." I wasn't sure myself how I had done it. I had quite liked Penfold, but it just came so naturally to humiliate and abuse him, and obviously my creative juices must have been in full flow. It was a routine that was to be repeated many times, not always with smallcock insults, but with a veritable smorgasbord mix of humiliation that could pour from my lips. I had to use a lot of creative imagination because I had precious little BDSM equipment with which to work. In the weeks to come, one of the other girls even asked to sit in a session and watch me in action. She said she wanted to learn my secrets, but in the end, she decided to stick to safer sex. The fact that none of the other women could handle the domination clients was an ideal opportunity for me. By then I knew what each of them would or would not do, and I knew that none of them would consider performing any sort of anal services on a man. Guys would ask all the time to have fingers stuck in their arses, or would want the women to use a strap on to fuck them. The girls all had a similar reaction. "Not doing that. I'm not touching them there." So I would constantly be taking phone calls, asking for various anal games, and I would have to turn them away. I soon recognized that a common theme was developing. One of the brothels in which I was answering the phones had one very small room that the girls never wanted to use because it didn't have a proper bed. That was not the slightest problem for me because I had no intention of sleeping with anyone and no intention of letting men get close enough to lay me down and touch me. At some time in the past, a half-hearted attempt had been made to kit out this little room as an amateur dungeon. The walls and ceiling were painted matte black, and there was an ultraviolet light in the ceiling. A bench sat on the floor and a wooden cross was fixed to the wall. If the working girls didn't ever want to use it, then I had to seize the initiative. I was still very much a student, and all of this was really just for a bit of fun. But I had studied enough business theory to recognize that there was a market here, with needs that weren't being met. Perhaps I could contribute to a much-needed supply. I started on a small scale, using the unloved room to deal with the submissive guys who called or turned up at the door. I saw some weird and wonderful people, but found every one of them interesting and fun. I never tried to judge people, and although much of what I was asked to do was way outside my own experience, I tried hard to make them happy. There were some things that I wouldn't do, not because I found them too strange, but because they were outside of my own limits. Even so, There were some memorable moments when even I found it hard to understand what pleasure it might bring to a client. One of the weirdest was the man who liked me to stand on his head. At first, I didn't quite understand what he wanted me to do, but then he lay down on the floor and explained it in detail. He wasn't into boot worship or a foot fetish. He didn't want bondage or any form of sexual relief. He would come in and I would stand on his head in silence. 10 minutes later he would say, "Thank you, I'm quite happy, that's fine," before paying my minimum charge for 1 hour and then leaving. Not all of the money was earned as easily as that, but soon I was getting enough business to think about buying some equipment of my own to help my fledgling enterprise to grow. I can still remember my first few purchases. In fact, I'm pretty sure that some of them are still around my dungeon somewhere. I wanted something in rubber, something in leather, and something in PVC. The solution was to get a rubber dress, a leather dress, and some thigh-high PVC boots. I added a few smaller items such as some lockable wrist cuffs and a pair of nipple clamps. I planned to use my new equipment in the brothels where I was mating, but also to start offering an entirely new service. I could do outcalls, taking my domination services into people's homes. It meant that all of my clothing and equipment needed to fit into one small suitcase, which I also still have. This was to be the smallest mobile dungeon in the world. Chapter 16. My little case of horrors. Looking back now on my time as a visiting dominatrix, I can see that it is one of the most scary things any young woman could do, taking a late-night trip alone to a hotel room or to somebody's private home, dressed up in sexy lingerie, rubber or leatherwear, and knowing that your customer is hungry for sexual excitement. Although I always made it crystal clear that sex with me was never a part of the deal, there was the ever-present fear of not knowing precisely what situation I might be walking into. I was tall, fit, and athletic, and felt confident about looking after myself in most situations. But there was always the danger that more than one man might be waiting for me inside every room I entered. The job was certainly not for the faint-hearted, and I soon developed my own regular survival routine designed to keep as safe as possible and yet still allow me to earn my living. That routine would start with the initial telephone call from somebody wanting to make a booking. By this second year of my life at university, I was regularly placing advertisements in local newspapers, and most of my clients found me that way. The adverts were very specific and aimed only at men seeking domination services rather than a straight escort girl. Many of the women with whom I have become friends over the years have been escort girls, and I have nothing but respect for the tens of thousands of girls who practice the world's oldest profession as working girl prostitutes. But I have always known that that lifestyle is not for me. By this stage of my life, my own sexual tastes were already clearly determined. I liked fetish wear. I liked dressing up in striking rubber or leather outfits. I liked being in charge. I liked, metaphorically speaking, being the one on top. And dominating men or women was the way that my own sexual appetite could best be satisfied. Working as a prostitute and having to have submissive sex in any way that the man might have desired was the last thing in the world that would have interested me. For all those reasons, my advertisements were designed to appeal only to a particular class of clientele. They would usually say something like domination services, uniforms, fetish wear, and fantasy, or words to that effect, and they worked better than I could possibly have imagined. My telephones rang off the hook with guys wanting to book my services. Because I was the only woman advertising domination work within my area, I had long known that there were a lot of people who were excited by the thought of BDSM activity, but the sheer scale of the demand took me by surprise. I quickly developed a telephone answering routine which, with some modifications, has served me well to this day. The first essential when a client telephones me is to ensure that they are not making the call from a withheld number. I know that many men are nervous about allowing their number to be known in such circumstances, but we are about to enter into a two-way contract here, and I need to know with whom I am doing business. The idea that a man might let a dominatrix have his telephone number and then be subject to some form of blackmail or harassment is the wildest form of media-induced paranoia. Quite apart from the fact that I have never wanted to cheat or steal from anyone in my entire life, there is the overriding fact that I will want you to visit me again and again and again in the future. As with any other commercial concern, my success depends on making my customers happy enough that they want to return. I have always prided myself that almost everyone who ever comes to visit me comes back again to repeat the experience. So, after weeding out those callers who had hidden their numbers, I would ask if my potential client had visited a mistress before and what services he was seeking. The question can elicit a number of responses. Some men stammer, stutter, mumble a few unintelligible words and then hang up. That may mean they were time wasters in the first place, getting their sexual kicks from the thrill of placing such a naughty call and hearing a sexy woman's voice on the telephone. Others may be genuine, but so shy about discussing their secret fantasies that their courage fails them. That is okay with me. I am shy myself and know how hard it can be to open up one's secret life to another. In many cases, my callers may be taking the first tentative steps towards fulfilling fantasies that have been the unspoken heart of their deepest sexual desires for a lifetime. Assuming, however, that my caller was still on the line, I would have a brief discussion about the desires they had, or would perhaps even prompt them slightly to be honest about whatever fantasy floated their particular boat. It might be rubber or leather, or the idea of tight bondage and being teased and denied. Some would ask how hard I could cane them, or whether water sports were on offer. Never a problem with my ever-ready bladder. The answers from me would always be honest, but always brief. Women in any branch of the adult industry soon become experts in identifying and dismissing the telephone wankers desperate for a cheap thrill and to pay for their pleasures. I enjoy masturbation as much as the next girl, but I would rather you performed it as a solo activity instead of down the telephone line with me. In these internet days, it is easy for me or my reception service to simply ask for such requests to be put in an email. In my younger days, I had to rely on telephone skills to reach a verdict about a caller. Occasionally, the initial call would flag up some danger signs. There are a couple of us here, me and my friend. Can you see us both at the same price? Such questions automatically earned the reply, sorry, I only do one-to-one calls, and I would keep a note of the phone number. That way, if they called back again, I would know not to go there. In those days, few people had mobile phones, and so I would always call back the landline number to make sure it was correct, and then check that the phone code matched the address they had given. Sometimes, despite all my precautions, I would get calls I called scrubs, time wasters who had given a false address or where nobody answered the door. The number of scrubs varied depending on the time of night, and you could generally get a feel for them. Sometimes I would think, not 100% sure, but if I had nothing else going, I would take a chance. Sometimes I would get a whole evening of time wasters, whilst on other evenings everybody would prove to be a genuine call. Most of the requests were for 1-hour visits, although on a quiet night I would accept half-hour sessions. Whipping and wonking, I used to call them. On the shorter sessions, it was difficult to always change into the right outfit. Obviously, if the client had requested a specific scenario, then I would change, but I didn't want to spend my time messing about. By the time I got in and had a quick check around, from the moment I walked in the door that clock was ticking. I would be very, very strict with the timekeeping, because I think I charged, when I first started out, £60 for a half hour, £120 for an hour, but then it rapidly went up to £150 because that was what everyone else was charging. Arriving at a private house triggered an automatic safety routine that I followed religiously. If the house had different curtains at different windows, then it was likely to be a set of bedsits, and therefore potentially more dangerous. If the engine of a car outside was warm, it suggested somebody had just arrived. And if more than one car was warm, I would not go in. I would pause by the door and listen. If I heard a conversation, I would not go in. My aim was to only enter houses where there was just one guy, hopefully the man who had arranged to meet me. Once inside, I would emulate the guests on the modern-day television series Come Dine With Me and insist on having a good look around the entire house. On occasions, I have found somebody hiding in another room, and have even walked in on young children fast asleep in the nursery while Daddy was arranging a bedtime story of his very own. For a while I was paranoid about wardrobes because a man once called me up and teased me that he had watched me in a session with his friend by hiding inside the bedroom cupboard. After that, my checks always included opening wardrobe doors. I never found anybody hiding inside, but did uncover hidden cameras trained on the bed. I had no wish to contribute unwittingly to anybody's private collection of adult movies. The routine was similar for hotel visits, slightly safer, because I would always have checked out who was occupying the room, but with the added complication of having to pass hotel security. How one dressed was all important. I had a selection of wigs because you would not want your appearance to become known to the security staff in the major Heathrow hotels, for instance. Then I would usually be wearing fetish clothes of some kind, covered with a big coat which made midsummer calls a nightmare. I had one favorite coat for a long time that I bought second-hand in Portobello Road Market just because it was great for hiding a multitude of sins. To add to the problem of being inappropriately dressed in hot weather, I would have to wear boots so as not to carry them with me. Although I always had a pair of high-heel stilettos as well in my traveling case, boots or stilettos would fit the bill for most of my clients. Only once was I chased out by the hotel security. Well, actually they didn't chase me out, they followed me up to the room. Understandably, the security guys wanted to keep an eye on who was coming in and out of their hotel, but luckily my client had mentioned that the staff seemed vigilant and so had given me his real name. As he opened the door I was able to say, "Hi, John, haven't seen you in ages," and that solved the problem. The case I would take with me on all of my appointments was a carefully selected little chamber of horrors. The exact contents would vary depending on what the client might have requested, and I would have plenty of bits and pieces in the car to select exactly the mix that might please. The most important tools for the job were usually a strap-on dildo, a whip, a crop, and some form of fetish outfit. I had something rubber, something leather, and something PVC, and a couple of specific uniforms such as a policewoman and a teacher's gown. Then came the basics of latex gloves, condoms, tissues, and always a bag to put rubbish in. I would squeeze in a few ropes, some leather cuffs, a set of clothes pegs, and a set of nipple clamps. Depending on what the client had requested, I might also be equipped with a spare pair of stockings and super-sized knickers in which to dress him up. With my commercial head on, I would always have a few printed cards as well. You need to do all that you can to encourage repeat business from satisfied customers. As I gained more experience, I was always seeking to improve my service and to give the customer more of what they wanted. It meant that I was steadily picking up more stuff. I had to buy a riding crop, for example, following a customer's request. Then someone else would ask for something different, and so I was always adding new items. One of the earliest additions to my stock was a set of heavy-duty, professional police-issue handcuffs. It was impossible to escape from them without the key, which one night was to lead to near disaster. Although I had been playing BDSM games since my school days, I was still very much a learner when it came to the intricacies of human bondage. I did not then have the experience to understand the importance of Murphy's Law, that old adage that states, if anything can go wrong, it will go wrong. The man with whom I discovered the terrible truth of Murphy's Law was more than a little tied up at the time. In fact, he was handcuffed naked to the metal bedpost in his own house. By this time I had gained a number of regular customers who appeared to appreciate my genuine enthusiasm for bullying, beating, humiliating, or teasing them into submission. Among these was Brian, in his mid-30s, tall and slim with attractive dark curly hair. He was, in truth, not bad looking, and in other circumstances he might have caught my eye for more non-professional reasons. I was with him that night, however, on a strictly commercial basis, and neither of us had any interest in an extramarital affair. He simply needed regular visits from me to make his sexual life complete, because his wife, whom he clearly adored, did not share his passion for bondage and humiliation. Brian had developed a regular routine. Once every few months, presumably for some family reason which he never revealed to me, his wife would go out for the evening. She never returned before 11 p.m. at the earliest. On those evenings he would book me for a 2-hour session at his home. We had a strict timetable to which we always adhered. I would arrive no later than 7 p.m. We would spend a bare minimum of time on greeting each other, and he would then demand to be tied up and humiliated in every way that I could imagine. At 9 p.m. on the dot I would depart. Although I never saw the aftermath, I always presumed that Brian then spent the next 2 hours making beds and cleaning rooms to ensure that no trace of my presence was ever left behind to alert his wife to my temporary presence in their home. The arrangement had worked perfectly smoothly on several occasions. Before the fateful night of my birthday eve, I had arrived dressed smartly, but not overtly sexily. As usual, I was freshly showered and scrupulously clean, but without any trace of perfume or body lotion that might linger and cause my client subsequent marital problems. By contrast, Brian met me at the door stark naked. His bursting erection was a clear signal of his eagerness to get on with the job in hand. In my youthful enthusiasm to constantly improve my domination skills, I was also keen to head for the bedroom. I had purchased a new bondage toy that week and was eager to show it off. On previous visits, I had tied Brian's arms to the bedhead, and then, as a climax to the evening's events, I had released his right arm so that he might masturbate himself to orgasm whilst I continued to provide the humiliation he desired. That transition from helpless bondage to one-handed freedom, although necessary for him to gain the release he craved, had always proved awkward. The need to fumble and untie the knots, holding just one of his hands, whilst leaving the other firmly bound, could not help but spoil the mood which I had worked hard to create. Now I had found the answer: a set of metal handcuffs. These were not mere summer's sex shop toys, but police-issue, escapable, hardened metal cuffs that could be opened only with their key. It was but the work of a moment to handcuff Brian's left wrist to the railings of the bedhead, calming his moment of panic by teasingly dangling the key in front of his eyes and then dropping it safely down into my cleavage. The inside of my bra and the depths of my knickers were two havens which all of my clients knew they would never be able to reach. Once he was secured, I set about my evening's task of humiliating him in every way I could. For starters, that usually involved me heaping verbal abuse on his head, telling him how pathetic he looked in the nude, how perverted he was, and how inadequate was his penis. To divert from my story for a moment, I should point out that a truly astonishing number of men want me to tell them their penis is too small to satisfy a woman. I understand, of course, that penis size strikes at the very heart of their male sense of worth, and that it is therefore an easy target, so to speak, for anyone who wishes to enjoy feelings of humiliation and degradation. Even so, I have struggled over the years to understand why even perfectly adequately endowed men seem happy and excited to be shamed in this way. My only answer is that the very act of openly criticizing the size of a cock may remove the pressure on said cock to perform. If my teasing words can release a client from any need to compete with every other cock in the world, then he may as well lay back and enjoy whatever sensations are being inflicted upon him. Just for the record, the latest scientific research suggests that the mean length of an erect member is about 5.88 inches 14.9 centimeters, that is a little less than was once thought. A correction required because early studies has asked men to measure themselves about as unreliable a method as you could possibly devise. My own experience of many tens of thousands of penises over decades of intimate research suggests that such a measurement may still be a tad on the generous size. Many men are in reality somewhat smaller than the theoretical research suggests. It just goes to show that you can prove anything with the proverbial lies, damned lies, or statistics, but I should perhaps mention that I have a slightly vested interest in the matter. My own preference is for a partner as well endowed as possible, preferably a substantial penis attached to a muscular bodybuilder's physique. In the still of the night, however, few men of any size can measure up to the lure of my Hitachi magic wand vibrator, or as they say on television, other vibrator brands are available. However, putting penises to one side for the moment and returning to the thread of my handcuff story, I was having fun insulting Brian with the sharp end of my tongue, mixing all the verbal abuse I could muster with a few accompanying slaps to his most sensitive regions, plus a fair bit of saliva for good measure. Brian enjoyed me spitting all over his body and had a particular taste for being told to open his mouth whilst I spat forcibly between his lips. He didn't mind if it was my natural saliva or if I took drinks of water to wet my whistle before spraying his face and body. Anything suitably wet and perverted would do. I had already moved on to some other humiliating games when I realized that a change of position was needed. From my earliest days as a fledgling dominatrix, I was well aware that the human body was never designed to be strapped in any one position for long. The dangers of cramp, of restricting blood supply, and even, in extreme cases, of thrombosis are all too real. I have always made it a strict rule to regularly demand a change of position to avoid any interruptions to my games. In this case, that meant that retrieving the key from my underwear in the most teasing way possible, and then unlocking the handcuffs still securing his left arm to the headrail. I am sure you are already ahead of me in knowing what happened next. I should say in advance that I am never one for swearing where it can possibly be avoided. But sometimes, as in the opening scenes of For Weddings and a Funeral, only oft-repeated swear words will do. In this case, that meant that retrieving the key from my underwear in the most teasing way possible, and then unlocking the handcuffs still securing his left arm to the headrail. I am sure you are already ahead of me in knowing what happened next. I should say in advance that I am never one for swearing where it can possibly be avoided. But sometimes, as in the opening scenes of For Weddings and a Funeral, only oft-repeated swear words will do. Oh, fucking hell, the key snapped. I cried. Oh, fucking hell, it's what? He responded. The fucking key, it's broken off in the fucking lock. I can't get the fucking cuffs unlocked. What do you mean, it's fucking broken? Let me out for Christ's sake. I'm fucking trying, but I don't know what to do. I will leave the rest of this increasingly offensive conversation to your own imagination. I honestly cannot quite remember the next 5 minutes in any detail as the full horror of the situation struck home. I tried grasping the broken stump of the key with my fingernails in a vain attempt to make it turn. Brian tried shouting a lot and banging his hand on the bed. I tried calm reasoning to work out a potential solution. Brian tried screaming, shouting and weeping with frustration. What in God's name am I going to do? He pleaded. My wife's coming home. How can I possibly explain what I'm doing like this? I have to confess that I was somewhat at a loss to offer him any positive answers. My customer was not just naked and handcuffed to the bed, but what I did not want to remind him of at that precise moment was that I had wrapped almost an entire roll of brown packing tape tightly around his testicles. Normally, he would have had plenty of time to peel the tape off and dispose of it before his wife returned. Now, time was a luxury we no longer enjoyed. The PVC packing tape had softened slightly in the heat of his groin, and his luxuriant growth of pubic hair appeared to be firmly stuck in the warm adhesive. He was literally caught by the short and curlies. I tried a gentle tug at the end of the tape. What the fuck are you doing? You're pulling my bollocks off. I'm trying to help. Well, don't. There was another issue which Brian seemed momentarily to distracted, to consider, but which was literally staring me in the face as he writhed on the bed in front of me, purely to make him happy and increase his humiliation. I had earlier taken a black marker pen and written a few choice endearments across his naked skin. The large handwritten words spelled out some of the obscenities with which he had wanted to be described. I remember he had the word slut in perfectly crafted capital letters across his chest, whore across his abdomen, teeny cock precisely where it had seemed appropriate, and although he didn't know it then, an arrow pointing sharply downwards across his back with the instructions fuck here clearly printed across the top of his bum cheeks. Being the kind mistress that I am, I had chosen a non-permanent ink, and I knew from experience that a painful half hour with the soapy scrubbing brush would have erased it completely. Unfortunately, that might now be 30 minutes too long. Amid scenes approaching mad panic, I wondered if there was a hacksaw in the house, but Brian was convinced his toolkit did not run to such luxuries. Then, I had a brainwave. The handcuffs had come with a spare key. The problem was, it was at my home, and that was almost a 30-minute drive away. My client protested vociferously at the idea of me leaving him alone in the house, but there was nothing else to do. As I left the bedroom, he was frantically and one-handedly attempting to pluck adhesive and hairs from his taped nether regions. He had clearly decided that having his genitalia resembling a partially plucked turkey was going to be the least of his problems. I drove as fast I could to the flat where I was temporarily staying with a friend in the course of my nomadic existence at the time. Running in, I grabbed the key, jumped back in the car, and sped back to Brian's home. Disaster. Whatever I did, the new key could not be inserted into the lock because of the broken stump firmly stuck in the mechanism. I thought, this is ridiculous. I'm going to have to find a hacksaw. So I had to leave him again to look for a local hardware shop, even though by this time it was getting late. There was a B&Q store near me that shut at 9 o'clock, and I managed to drive there, buy a hacksaw, and drive back yet again. By this time, Brian understandably seemed to have lapsed into a state of shock and deep panic and was pleading, "Oh my God, my wife is going to be home soon. You have to help me, please." Well, at least we now had a hacksaw, and so I started sawing away at the metal band around his wrist. But these were police-quality handcuffs, not cheap rubbish. I have always prided myself on buying the best possible equipment, and I soon had to admit defeat. I honestly don't think I can get through this. The only answer is to get somebody in. I'll call the guy who sometimes drives me to come over and help. That idea seemed merely to send him deeper into panic mode. No, you can't do that. Please, Brian. Let me get my driver because I cannot do this on my own. I can cover you with the duvet so he never even sees your face. You will just have your hand exposed, nothing else. I can't cut through this myself. But Brian refused to countenance the idea, and so I kept on sawing, making little headway. Then I concentrated on the smaller links in the chain. My arm was aching, and I seemed to have been cutting for hours. Bear in mind that I had arrived about 7 p.m., and by now it was approaching 10 o'clock, and his wife due home within the hour. Eventually, even though I could not cut through the wristband, I did manage to sever the links between the two handcuffs and release him from the bed, leaving him with half a handcuff dangling from one wrist and the other half still attached to the bedhead. I exited the house as fast as I could, because I knew I might bump into the wife coming home. Eventually, even though I could not cut through the wristband, I did manage to sever the links between the two handcuffs and release him from the bed, leaving him with half a handcuff dangling from one wrist and the other half still attached to the bedhead. I exited the house as fast as I could, because I knew I might bump into the wife coming home. I later heard from Brian that he had virtually demolished the bedhead to get the other handcuff band removed and had then fled to the sanctuary of his brother's home to cut the bracelet off his wrist for packing tape removal, obscenity graffiti scrubbing, and to compose himself before returning to domestic bliss. All's well that ends well, I said. One day, we'll laugh at this. Brian did not seem to appreciate the joke. A long time afterwards, I read in the Times that the London Fire Brigade was dealing with an increasing number of calls to domestic incidents in which people had locked themselves to the bed with handcuffs and then lost the key. The spokesman put this down to the 50 Shades effect and the consequent rise in amateur bondage games. Nothing new under the sun, I thought. The only person in real danger in the aforementioned unfortunate incident was the client himself. But it did make me realize that working alone was both awkward and potentially highly dangerous if anything went wrong. From that point onwards, I started using minicabs for my outcalls. It added greatly to my costs, but brought a huge bonus in terms of personal safety. I always carried a walkie-talkie radio and let the client know that I was staying in contact with my driver outside until my checks were complete. Then, assuming I had found nothing untoward, I would check the money, start unpacking my little suitcase of BDSM goodies, and let the driver know how long I would be. Literally 2 minutes before the hour or half hour was up, he would call and say, "Time," and then, if I did not reply, would knock on the door. My anally retentive attitude to my safety did succeed in keeping me out of harm's way until, that is, one night when a visit to a charming and harmless client turned into a nightmare, with a carving knife being waved in my face as I desperately tried to get out of the door.